Hello, everybody. Hi. Hello, thank you all for coming to our session, and apologies for the late start due to a security issue early on. My name is Luba Kassova. I'm a researcher, journalist, and co-founder of the International Audience Strategy, ACAS. I'm the author of a series of 3 reports about the missing perspectives of women in news, all of which were commissioned by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. In fact, by Miguel Castro, who is here in the audience, without whom, over there, none of the insights you're going to hear today would have been possible. And we're here to discuss the key findings from the latest report, From Outrage to Opportunity. There are QPR codes that you can download it if you wish. And we're going to focus a lot more on the solutions than the problems. I want to introduce the magnificent panel here. You're really in for a treat. Every time I speak with any of these panelists, I learn something new, so I'm sure you will too. Starting with Richard Addy. He's a co-founder and director at ACAS and is currently a board member of the Guardian.org, Africa No Filter and Mind. Richard has been involved in a large number of news media projects, including for the BBC, Channel 4, The Guardian, EU Observer, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other foundations. Richard is also the quant lead for the Missing Perspectives of Women in News reports and the author of the business case for gender equity. Next, we have Pamela Setoni. She's a journalist for more than 20 years and currently group managing editor at the Nation Media Group in Kenya. She has previously served as managing editor of Nation Media Group's flagship product, The Daily Nation. Among many achievements, in 2019, she set up the first gender desk in Kenya and in Africa, which has gone on to be a real success in making journalism more gender equitable at Nation Media Group. We have Amanda Barrett next to her, a Vice President for News Standards and Inclusion at the AP. She oversees the Nerve Center, the AP's global news coordination hub, talent development, news research, and news verification. In 2020, Amanda created an inclusive storytelling effort focused on broadening the global AP news reports to bring in more diverse viewpoints. Currently, more than 100 inclusion champions across the AP News teams liaise to make journalism more equitable at AP. And last but not least, Jane Barrett is the global editor, news strategy for Reuters. She leads editorial innovation at Reuters and has been involved in 2 projects looking at the representation of women in the news agency. So without further ado, let's begin. What Richard and I are going to do is take you through very briefly through the key insights and selected interventions that we believe are really important in driving progress in journalism. And then we will link up some of these solutions with the professional and personal experience of our panelists who are going to talk about how they have implemented some solutions and what the roadblocks were. So starting off with problem 1 of 4, the representation problem. Our latest data show that across key beats, such as politics, business, and foreign affairs, women hold as few as 1 in 6 editorial roles across 6 countries that we look at: India, Kenya, South Africa, Nigeria, the UK, and US. Women of colour in multiracial societies, specifically UK, US and South Africa, are all often completely locked out of editorial decision making. Just to give you an example, in politics, across the 6 countries, 1 in 4 roles, most senior roles in politics currently held by women. In the UK, it's 1 in 5. In Kenya, none. And in terms of women of colour, in the UK, they're completely locked out. There aren't any women of colour in politics, be it foreign affairs or business. And they're marginalised in South Africa and in the States. The inclusion problem. This is definitely a blind spot for the news industry. And what we mean by that is, once women have a seat at the table, is their voice heard? Or so unfortunately, we found that out of 168 initiatives that we analysed, initiatives in news that aim to bring equity, only 7% mention culture change explicitly. And the inclusion problem is considerably more challenging for women of colour. I would go as far as to say that it's a crisis situation that needs urgent addressing urgently, and we can go into the detail in questions if you wish. Thirdly, we have the coverage problem, which is twofold. It's the missing stories about structural gender inequalities, and secondly, the share of voice of women being drowned out by men. Currently, men's share of voice exceeds that of women by a factor of 3 globally, and it's much more exacerbated in some countries like Nigeria, where it's 6-1, and India 5-1, or the other way around. 1 in 5,000 articles only mention gender. One of 7 key gender gaps that disadvantage women structurally compared to men. And there are a number of reasons for why that's the case, and we'll go into them in the solutions bit. Handing over to you, Richard.
And then the 4th problem that Luba came across in the research was what we're calling the gender news consumption gap, which really shocked us when we analysed it. We looked at nearly 2,000 news organisations, and we saw that between those organisations there was a 15 to 16% gender consumption gap, i.e. gender consumption points gap, i.e. men consume more news than women. When you looked online, and we've looked at some latest data for this festival, online there's a 22% online gender news consumption gap. That's looking at all top news organisations across the world. And this is in the context, remember, of global news revenues halving in the last 20 years. Since 2000, in the last 7 years, they've gone down by a quarter, and we're lucky if in the next 10 years they'll go down by another quarter. Thank you, Luba. And then again, in the context that the Reuters Digital News Report recently, the 2022 version, showed that there's a large number, increasing number of news avoiders. And those news avoiders are likely to be women because they're finding there's too much politics. At the time, there's too much coverage of COVID, and the news is making them feel depressed in a bad state of mind. So there's a real sense of a change that's needed to start to reduce the news gender consumption gap. So we've talked about the representation problem, the inclusion problem, the coverage problem, and the gender news consumption gap. But we haven't left it just looking at problems. We've started to think, Luba started to think about the solutions. And critically, as well as the detailed solutions looking at across all the news value chain, it's critical that we start off by looking at some of the more systemic, more fundamental ways of understanding the challenges. So in terms of the first one, in terms of the structural solutions, was looking at the consolidating efforts at an industry level, especially for those in a position that they can make a difference at the industry level. When we looked at the 168 initiatives that Luba talked about earlier, we found only 10% of them looked at systemic level change. And organizations can try to make a difference, but unless there's a systemic level change, it's not sustainable. And so looking at consolidating efforts is critical. The second structural level solution was around gender audits, and this is something that every single organization can do and needs to do. Gender audits where you understand across the whole value chain to what extent women and women of color are being excluded. And critically, that needs to be an intersectional assessment. So when we looked at a number of diversity reports, only 2.5% of them looked at women of color, the representation and the inclusion of women of color. And then finally, in terms of the structural solutions, setting out what are the strategic gender equity goals from the top of the organization. Again, we did some research to validate this, and when we looked at diversity reports, only about a quarter of them were fronted by the CEO or the editor-in-chief. And when we looked at one case study, Mint, which is in the report when you look through it, they talk very clearly about the need for conscious leadership around diversity and inclusion of women and women of colour. Luba?
Great. So going back to, I will share a few more solutions with you, and Richard actually, around each of the problem areas, and then we'll discuss those with the panel. So the first one, echoing what Richard just said, is how absolutely critical it is to set intersectional targets for leadership and in newsrooms. And the reason why they should be intersectional is because otherwise women of color remain invisible. They are not associated strongly enough with men of color or with women. Therefore, they remain on the periphery, and it's incredibly important to change that. Secondly, introducing a suite of gender policies is really important, and this is something that we covered in the second report. And very importantly, it's attaching a leader in an organization that it can make sure that they're implemented, because often gender policies are not implemented. And there are key, very important ones that need to be in place around parenting and childcare, safety, sexual harassment, recruitment to eliminate bias at that point, career development, training, and others. Finally, focusing on talent retention programs. During the interview, interviews with 41 senior editors across the globe, we found that they thought that the pinch point where women most likely to leave is at mid-management level. So there is a real need to have talent retention programs where, and for example, Bloomberg introduced one, senior women workshops. And what they found that out of the 60 women who completed middle managers that program, only one left the organization, and most of them got promoted. So these are really important interventions. Another advice that was given by a senior leader was to split the roles that look after recruitment and those that look after career development of their staff. The inclusion problem. Measuring inclusion, again, Richard made a very good case for audit, so I don't need to repeat that. But what I want to say is that at the moment, there are very few that, if anyone, that does this properly. And once the baseline is established about what are the behaviors that make people feel secure and able to really contribute to decision making, then once you have the baseline, then set targets. Setting targets is really important. And one that I want to dwell on very deliberately is not to expect women of color to run DEI programs, which typically happens in organizations, because they suffer quadruple bind. On the one hand, they are dealing with gender bias. Overlaid to that is racial bias. And then the third challenge is that they're expected to resolve the problem of their own underrepresentation at a risk to their own careers. And finally, they typically are seen as a really strong supportive group for everyone else, which means they are more likely to burn out, to leave organizations, to feel isolated, lonely, and incredibly stretched. So what's really, I couldn't stress this with any more passion, is it's important that the overrepresented and most powerful group within organizations takes charge or is at the top of these initiatives, and they bring in talent who are actually able to shield people of color, but especially women of color, from the enormous pressure that they're under. In terms of the coverage problem, how do we unlock progress, both in terms of bringing more voices of women, but also in terms of improving storytelling? The panel will have incredible things to say today, because they're all on a journey in a different way, so it's going to be a very interesting discussion. But what I can say is that there are two different approaches: the vertical one, which is about setting up beats, gender beats or race beats, and the horizontal, which is about having champions, inclusion champions that look for inclusive angles and coverage across all beats. And the downside, as we understood from the interviews, of having a beat is that the danger is to ghettoize content about women who ultimately are 50% of the population. And the downside of having a horizontal approach is that those angles tend to be deprioritized, or there is not enough skill to know what it is that we're looking for in terms of gender angles. So there are the trade-offs. Over to you, Richard.
So the final element is around how to close the gender news consumption gap. And in the report, Luba was lucky enough to get data from A Media, which is the largest local news provider in Norway with 80 titles. And they've done some fascinating work, some fascinating detailed work. And what they've shown is that there's a positive relationship with having a higher share of women authors. That leads to a higher share of protagonists in stories. Those higher share of protagonists in stories leads to a higher share of women readers, and those higher share of women readers leads to a higher share of subscribers. So in that, just that simple relationship leads to higher share of women subscribers. Secondly is around improving the share of voice amongst experts and protagonists. As Luba said, there's a factor of 3.3 men more than women in terms of share of voice. But this is one of the things that we have tracked that has improved slightly over time, probably down to the increased use of expert databases and initiatives. So for example, in Bloomberg, they measure diversity in their content weekly, and they share it out in the organization. BBC 50/50, that many of you may know, Laura Drinides, who's one of the leads on that, talks about counting is key. Counting the share of voice on a regular basis is absolutely key. And Nation Media Group, the target set for women protagonists in the stories, so the whole organisation or the whole beat knows what it's going towards. And finally, developing women-inclusive products and formats to generate extra revenues. So most news organizations, especially now in terms of AI and social media and digital, are thinking about innovation and thinking about new products. We argue that an absolutely key opportunity are products and services and formats that are women-friendly without excluding men. Why? Because if you close the gender consumption gap by 1 percentage point, you're likely to increase your revenues by 1 percentage point. We've done some work looking at the business model. Over the next 5 years, if the gender consumption gap across the world was closed by 1% each year, that would generate an additional $11 billion. If that occurred over 10 years, an additional $38 billion. And it's not just us who are saying that. World press trends have shown that if a news organization has diversity as one of its development priorities, it's likely to be one of the most profitable news organizations globally. So that's the case for these solutions.
Thank you so much, Richard. And one thing that we both feel very passionate about is the profound, to convey the insight that in order to achieve to close that, or to start closing the gender consumption gap, we need to make changes along the whole news value chain. Hence why today we'll be covering few areas. We're not just going to be focusing on a representation or an inclusion, but the whole value chain, because unless we tackle it all, then the model, it's like a domino effect. If one doesn't work, the whole domino goes down, essentially. So, my first question is for you, Amanda, around going back to just focusing on the representation issue for a minute. How important it is to look at targets intersectionally, in your view, from your professional experience?
Thanks. I think it's very important. I think we need to remember that historically, women have had to fight for their place in the newsrooms. In the 1960s and the 1970s, women had to sue to be included in newsrooms, to even have jobs in newsrooms. And then there was a struggle to become leaders. But for women of color, that door has stayed shut in a lot of ways. There are a few of us sprinkled here and there, but generally what you see is that women of color get left out of the conversation. They're not necessarily decision makers, not necessarily the editors, and don't always get heard when they're proffering story ideas or talking about how to solve problems. One of the issues that we do face is that some people feel like when they hire white women, they therefore check the box. They think that therefore they don't need any other diversity. But we have to remember that there are millions and millions of women of color around the world whose perspectives have not been seen in our newspapers, in our online sites, and in most of our media, except in very small ways. So in order to solve this problem, we need to have women of color in the newsroom who are talking and bringing their perspective, their knowledge of their communities to the forefront, to talk about different story ideas that white people just wouldn't think about, to be able to reach those audiences who are out there. And this is not just an imperative for moral reasons, but it's a business imperative. The countries are changing, and there are more and more people of color. And if they don't feel like they're represented and they don't see themselves reflected, they're not going to be willing to pay for the journalism that we produce. So it really is an imperative to bring more women of color into the forefront and into our coverage so that we can more righteously represent the people that we're supposed to be covering.
Thank you so much. And Jane, linking to this, how does Reuters approach the issue of representation and diversity?
So in our newsroom, we have set targets for both female leadership and also people of colour in leadership, and that is both men and women. We feel very strongly, as you said, Luba, that we don't just want to make this a women issue. This is about diversity from all sorts of angles. And it's really interesting. We set the targets about 2 years ago, and we gave ourselves until the end of last year to hit our first set of targets. And I'm really pleased to say that we outperformed our targets on people of colour in leadership. We underperformed on getting more women into leadership, which was really interesting. I was expecting it to be the other way around, which shows maybe my own bias that, because I've managed to get up to the top, maybe other people can, but it really has taught us that, we set targets for growth. We didn't set targets for the final place that we wanted to be, right? Mm-hmm. So I very much believe that this is a journey that we are all on, that we don't know where we're going to end up, where we should end up. As Amanda so rightly says, the world is changing so quickly, and so what we set as a target for 22 might well be different from target for 27. And I'm delighted to say, by the way, that you can change one of your stats now, because we have now got a black woman in charge of one of our key business desks at Reuters. She was just named to be our global mining editor 2 weeks ago. So for the win,
Yay.
Ronnie Brown, there we go. It's really important to set these targets. It really helps focus people's minds when they're thinking about who are they developing, who are they interviewing, who are they encouraging to take on new jobs. If you as a manager are no longer allowed to say, oh, well, only 5 white men applied for the job, you're not allowed to say that anymore. You have to have a diverse group of people in order to help the whole company hit these targets. And so it really does move things.
Thank you so much. What I thought about when you were saying this is that we went through an evolution in writing the 3 Missing Perspectives report, and the final one we realized that setting targets of parity across the board and not taking culture into consideration is a real it's a model that imposes Western type of thinking around the world, and we've moved away from that, and we're thinking we have to take culture into account when we not we, but when organizations set targets, depending on how patriarchal the society is, so that they know what to expect. And incremental change is so much better than setting targets which are so unachievable that they're just ignored. But Pamela, what are the gender policies that your organization has implemented and to improve women's diversity and inclusion, and what were the setbacks along the way?
Thanks, Luba. For me, I think setting policies is very important, because this is a serious issue, and we cannot address the challenges that the report has exposed without binding organizations to adhere to certain policies, organizations and the leadership. So at Nation Media Group, where I work, we have a number of policies that address these issues along the entire value chain, starting with the recruitment policies, where recruitment has to be done on an equal basis, and there has to be a report to the board on how many new people have joined an organization, the organization in a quarter, and they are taken into account for the gender balance within that recruitment. There's also policies around flexible working hours for women, especially mothers who are breastfeeding, and providing opportunities for them to be able to have nursing rooms so that we can retain these women. As you said, we lose them at that stage. It's mostly got to do with having to deal with also family issues, so making the workplace conducive for women. We also have an anti-sexual harassment policy, which makes Nation a place that has zero tolerance for sexual harassment, because when you go back to look at why women leave, that has been cited as one of a key reasons for newsrooms in Africa. And then also, just in line with the policies, we also have targets, and the executive is actually expected to report to the board every quarter on the numbers of women at every level of the organization. In terms of the content, our editorial policy also outlines what you can write about women and why we must focus on serious issues that affect women. So that also directs the content, so that whatever goes out is content that women will be happy to interact with. But I think where we have failed and what we are working towards is really looking at how do we also enforce the idea of balancing the voice, ensuring that the women's voices are captured. And I really like what BBC has done with its 50-50. It's a model that we want to look at also adopting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Now moving to talent retention. Amanda, Jane, this question is for both of you. What works and what doesn't in terms of talent retention programs in your experiences at Reuters and AP?
We'll swap the Barretts around this time. So there have been a couple of things that I think have worked really, really well. And they really kind of come down to listening to people. And that kind of speaks to the point that Richard and Luba have made about inclusion and the culture of inclusion. It's really giving people a space to have a voice and to feel heard, not just by their peers, but also by senior management, and really to be able to debate things. And so to that end, we set up a couple of years ago, our editor for Newsroom Diversity, Joyce, set up some employee resource groups, which are pretty normal in other companies, but really haven't been very normal in newsrooms. And so we set up groups that were peer groups, but open to those sort of members and allies. And that was really, really critical, is to open it to allies as well. So we have the Women Journalists and Allies Network. We have the Black and Ethnic Minority ERG. We have the LGBTQ plus ERG, and we also now have a Next Gen ERG. And it's just a way of not trying to ghettoize people, because they are very much open, but it's a way for people to have a conversation, and for people like me, like our editor-in-chief, Alessandra, to listen in and to really hear and to understand what people are thinking. Not to criticize, not to come in with solutions, just to listen. And that's really important. If people feel that they have a voice and that they are part of the discussion, it really helps in retention. And then the other key one for me is mentoring. And in fact, my former colleague Emma, who's sitting over there, set up a fantastic mentoring matching program at Reuters, whereby she asked, and rightly put the onus on people who've been around for a while. It's like, well, you've got to start giving back, mentor some people. And so I think I've done 4 now in this round. And it's just been fabulous, and I've got some lovely stories about the mentors, which we can get to later if we have time, or over a drink after this session. But I think what I've really learned about that, having had some really bad mentors and a couple of good mentors when I was growing up, is that really, really good mentoring focuses on 3 things. And it's being able to share your knowledge. What have you picked up along the way? What tips, what techniques, what's the reading that somebody should do? It's your experience, which is different from knowledge. Knowledge is your head. Your experience is like how you lived it, and particularly where you messed up. That is, I think, find really, really powerful in mentoring, because it just humanizes it. Just because I've been around for 20 plus years and I've got to where I am doesn't mean that I've had a perfect line-up. And sort of humanizing a career path, I think, is really important. And then thirdly is really leveraging your network and using the people that you know, people that I might meet here, people that I know in our own organization, to help, sort of put the next paving stones for the path of the mentee. So really kind of using sharing your experience, sharing your knowledge, and sharing your network.
Thank you.
I'll jump in and say I agree that mentoring is very powerful. When I was a younger manager at AP, I had a mentor who was on the business side of the business, and that was really powerful because, for a long time, all I was thinking about were deadlines, getting something on the wire, and updating it quickly. And so having my friend Kate, she's been a friend for years now, as a mentor, was really good at broadening my perspective around what are the other journalism careers that are possible, and understanding things like managing conflict. Some lessons I learned from her that were really helpful for me. But beyond that, we actually have hired one person that focuses on recruitment and one person that focuses on talent development. They help us think about stretch assignments for people. We also have a program called LEAD, which is for non-managers. Not everyone wants to become a manager, but they might want to have different experiences. They might say that, okay, I've been a reporter in business, but now I want to go overseas. How do I get there? And they are matched up with the mentor who can help guide them, help them meet the right people, help them get some different kinds of assignments. And then one last thing we've been doing this year, we actually opened up an application for people to apply to go to cover the Olympics. Covering the Olympics at AP is huge. everyone wants to do it, although I've been twice. It is a lot of work. It's like 15 days of no sleep. But it's also a lot of fun. And we had a lot of success with having people from different beats going to cover the Olympics. So we've had business reporters, we've had race and ethnicity reporters go. And it brought a different flavor to the coverage. So now we've opened it up to all of news. People can apply. Not everyone will be accepted, obviously, but it will get some new people, some different skills. It might help them think about their careers differently. So we're really trying to make an effort to help people see the possibilities for them. Because when people don't see a possibility, they tend to leave. They just say, I'm done, I've reached the end, and I'm out of here. So you really have to think about helping, develop people's careers. It's also on them, obviously. They want to think about what they want to do, but they need to understand that there's a career path that they can take so things can be more fulfilling for them.
Thank you so much. The next question is for all three of you, if we can discuss it briefly so we can go through more questions. But it's a really important one, and I look forward to you all answering, perhaps starting with you, Pamela. What is your view about the vertical versus the horizontal approach to improving storytelling to be more equitable? And is this is this juxtaposition false, and we shouldn't really pit them against one another? But Pamela, I mean, obviously you have incredibly successful experience with the vertical.
This is a question we've grappled with a bit because I know that traditionally in many newsrooms, women are thrown in silos, and sometimes it's a silo that will just be talking about women's issues, and then the rest of the organization seems to move on and forget all about them. So when we decided to set up the gender desk, it had to take both approaches. I don't think it should be one versus the other. There's a way we can do both. And this is how we've done it. We believed that we needed to secure space to talk about women's issues. At the moment, with what newsrooms are going through, even pagination is an issue, and just getting a story in the mainstream, in the main news pages, can sometimes be difficult. So we secured space by setting aside a magazine that would focus on women's issues, and it goes as an insert in the main newspaper every week. But in addition to that, the gender editor plays a key role across the whole organization. So she sits in all the meetings in the morning when we are planning the day. She's there to pitch stories that will go online, gender-related stories, but she's also there to look at everybody else's pitch through a gender lens. She also gives feedback to the rest of the editors in terms of what they're getting right and what they're getting wrong in terms of including the both genders in the voice that is coming through our products. So, Luba, in my view, we can balance them out, and we are doing that quite well at Nation.
I think you need both. We have a race and ethnicity team, and they do their work and they focus on enterprise stories, but often they're called in to deal with breaking news. And by having them work with colleagues around the company, it's really helpful to have their perspective. Sometimes they are teaching someone something new that they didn't know or didn't understand, or discussing with them word usage or those kinds of things. So I think you really need the specialized beats, but you also need people to own it. People have to understand this is part of their job. Yeah. It's part of your job to accurately represent the community that you cover. Otherwise, you're not being accurate. So, you have to get out there and really talk to a wide group of people. And I think if we tackle it with both perspectives, then we get more results, and then it's not just someone shoveling the responsibility off on someone else.
And before we move to Jane, can I just very quickly ask you to comment on, now that you have 100 inclusion champions whose role is to look for angles, inclusive angles, what difference has it made?
Oh, the inclusion champions are so wonderful. When we started this journey, I was determined, that this was not going to be Amanda's project. And I told the leadership, this is your project too, like you have to be involved. And then when we decided to create inclusion champions, it just made such a huge difference in the coverage. I found that, for one thing, so many people are waiting to tell different kinds of stories with different people's perspectives and didn't feel like they had permission. Or they felt like their middle manager would say no to them. But by supporting them and allowing them to understand that this is a priority, they were able to tell those stories. But then the inclusion champions just ran with the effort. They formed their own little team to deal with issues that crop up in the coverage and to be able to reach out to different desk members. They've held roundtables to discuss issues like building diverse sources. They answer the questions of their colleagues and talk through story ideas. And I feel like it has made such a difference in the newsroom. You know, people aren't approaching being inclusive as just this task that they have to do. They're excited about it. And that's down to the inclusion champions who I just appreciate so much.
Thank you. Jane?
I think very similar to the other two, so I won't talk too long about it, but I think it's a shame that newsrooms haven't been able to do it in verticals, and that we've had to kind of create, that we haven't been able to, which one's which? We haven't been able to do it naturally, we've actually had to create a beat.
Yes.
Let's go with that one. And for me, it's a little bit like our climate coverage, right? We feel that climate should be part of every single beat, and yet it's really difficult to get those stories and to really corral them and make a difference and actually display them in a way that shows that we have been covering lots of things on climate. And so actually by having a climate editor and a climate team, everyone in the newsroom still has to report on climate, but now there's kind of a focus point. And we tried to just let 1,000 flowers bloom on inclusion, and it just hasn't worked. So we've actually, if anyone's interested here, we have a job application open at the moment for a race and justice editor, who will have a team in order to do some of the things that we've been discussing.
That's very encouraging.
We'll stop now.
So we have a dilemma. We have 10 minutes left and we really wanted to leave questions for you, but I also have very interesting questions for the panelists. So all those in favor of Q&A and me stopping the questions, hands up. All the ones in favor of us continuing with the scripted questions, hands up. And what's the third option that I haven't said? Pardon? Yeah, ask your questions. Who has, yes, the lady. Oh, there is a mic coming.
Hello, my name is Luba. I'm student journalism from Antwerp. First of all, thank you for this amazing discussion. I learned so much. But my question was, these are amazing solutions on how to approach women of color. But how are you teaching these white people on white privilege? And in Amanda's words, how are they not, this is a woman of color, she ticks the box and it's all right. How are you approaching them on their talents and not just because she's a woman of color? I don't know if there's a person.
I can actually take that one. So when the pandemic began at the AP, we started having conversations about coping with the coronavirus. They were called our coping calls. And then when the death of George Floyd occurred, they started to be about race. And we actually had some discussions around white privilege, around the history of racism in the country and in the world. And they were very helpful. And we've also had some sessions with the group, the Black at AP group has held some sessions to talk about these very issues. I think unless we talk about it, we can't tackle it. And, you know, there are people that kind of run from it and don't want to deal with it, but it's going to continue to be a problem unless we call out the issue, explain what it is, because some people don't know the terminology. And we're also a global company, so for us, you know, inclusion issues are different in different parts of the world. So we continue to have conversations and try to deal with those issues head on.
Yes, please.
Hi, Catherine Gisheru is my name. I just had a question for the panelists because I think all of you are saying the same thing. You need to have policies, you need to stand by what you have to have strategies. But what happens when you have beautiful strategies but they're not being implemented? And you're working in a newsroom that sings a beautiful song, but seriously it's out of tune with the reality. What then do you do? Thank you.
Does anyone want to, I mean, I can chip in, but I'd rather you guys speak. If you want to.
Can I just reflect the question back, because I couldn't hear it terribly well?
What happens when policies are not implemented, when all this is happening, but actually it's, there is policies in place, but they're not
being implemented? I mean, we're a big company, so we have, you can imagine our processes, are quite hefty, and that includes an annual appraisal system, whereby every single person in the company is measured against targets. We have made these targets everybody's targets. So if you are a manager and you have not had a diverse hiring panel, a diverse slate of candidates, you have not been working with the people who report to you to find good, diverse talent to bring them up, you get a bad mark. Like, it is, you just go back to school and you get a D, like a fail on that. And it impacts your end of year rating, which is linked to your pay and everything else like that. So we are holding people individually accountable for a corporate goal, and those corporate goals, plural. So you have to make it personal for people, I think. I think just the last bit of your question was the bit that I was still thinking about when Luba threw to me, but it was about, like, that if the world moves on and your goals actually aren't right anymore. And I think that's a really interesting point, because the world is changing, and I think it's on us as leaders to be on our toes, not just to say, oh, we set a goal, we hit the goal, yay. As I said earlier, it's a journey, right? And so we have to keep on reflecting those goals, like, it's okay, so we got to this, was that good enough? Is that getting us the results? Just because we have, women, people of colour in leadership, is that actually being reflected in our coverage? So, like, the goals will continue to evolve and to change, and it's really a nuanced business to do, but it's an important one to keep going on.
And can I add to that? I think, I will say to you that it's a frustrating journey. Mm-hmm. And there are times when you feel like progress has been made, and then you start to hear people say, we've solved this. We don't have to do this anymore. And you have to be the person that's always reminding them that this battle is never over. That's not always easy to do. It's frustrating. It burns you out, and it makes you angry. But, that's one of the driving forces for me, is making sure that we keep pushing. And I don't mind being an angry Black woman on this one.
Pamela, did you want to address?
My name is Derek Kane. I'm from...
Sorry, Pamela might want to add.
No,
Yes, I'll come back to you.
Just like Amanda says, we just keep pushing. This is not something easy we are trying to do, and it makes very many people uncomfortable, and you of course are always going against the wall. I can talk about our gender desk, but I cannot be proud of the organization that I come from, because we are still very far from getting those numbers right, but you have to keep working at it, and I think one person at a time, at one point we'll get there, maybe our children will.
Thank you. Back to you.
Yes. My name is Derek Kane. I'm from Resolve Philly. I'm the Director of Community Engagement. And this question kind of ties into what she just asked the panel. Amanda, earlier you said, and I like this, and I think this is why I think this should be highlighted more. When you talked about that, when you went to hire management, you said this isn't just my project, this is our project. I think that is an issue when we're talking about change in some of these organizations, and if the powers that be aren't in that room, how do you do that? So what made you say that I know what made you say that, but could you elaborate more on why you said that and why you emphasize that it's our project?
So I will say that there were two reasons I wanted to emphasize that. First of all, I had a different project where Jane and I first met. We were in an executive leadership program that really became my project, and it was so frustrating. That was around planning, and it had nothing to do with race, but it was really frustrating to have to push the boulder up the hill myself. So I had learned a lesson. But But the second reason was I was keenly worried that I cannot be the Black person telling everyone that they have to change. Like, y'all, I mean, you are people in charge, you gotta help. At the end of the day, it's their responsibility too. I'm a senior leader, but so are all the rest of them. And it's our collective responsibility to make change for the company, the coverage, and for all of our thousands and thousands of customers who are counting on us every day, who may not necessarily have the staff to do the work that we can do. So I just realized that we didn't make it all of our problem. And thankfully, with the staff, it's not a problem. They are just very excited about it.
Over here, we have 3 more questions. So there are 3 here, I think? Yes. Yeah. No, 2 here and 1 in the back, and that will be it.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. My name is Janice Littlejohn. I'm an independent journalist from Los Angeles, California. I wanted to follow up on the gentleman's question, just to extend it, looking at the solutions of don't expect women of color to run DEI programs and hire specialists. What are your organizations doing to allow you that extra assistance in terms of people that specialize, or organizations that specialize in these kinds of areas, so that you're not feeling burnt out?
Yes, do you want to ask your question and at the back, and then they'll take them?
Well, I just wanted to make a comment, so it's not really a question, and it will be not very comfortable comment. My name is Anna, I work at Minority Rights Group International, and I was very happy about this panel. I was very much looking forward to it. And I must say that I'm really disappointed that during 1 hour, 2 amazing women of color had 12 minutes of voice. I was looking on my watch, and I hope that we can do it better next time.
No, I'm sorry. Thank you for your feedback. There was 1 more question at the back, or comment? Oh yes, over here.
Hi, Annette Young, the host of 51%, a show about women on France 24, and a question directed to my colleagues at AP and Reuters, because what many people might not realise is even big organisations like France 24 depend so much on what your organisations provide. So thank you to both of you for doing the work you're doing. However, one thing, and I've worked for a news agency myself, is on the ground. When you've got journalists, particularly inexperienced journalists in far-flung bureaus, getting the message across to the reporters in terms of addressing gender equity issues and ensuring that there is a gender lens during reporting. I know it's a difficult question to ask. It's the last question and everybody here wants to wrap up, but I'd just be curious to know what is happening at AP and Reuters, because I can give you many examples where I've watched your raw feeds come in and I've gone, oh my goodness, that could have been done so differently.
So, Amanda, do you mind taking the first question?
Sure.
And then Jane the second.
So, as you're my customer, I'm sorry you've been disappointed. I'll start there. I will say that, you know, we've been talking a lot about how we can get journalists in the field, journalists at every level, to understand that they need to be thinking about inclusion wherever they are, whatever they're doing. And 3 things that we're really emphasizing are that you don't treat people as monoliths, that when we talk about getting people to comment, it's not man on the street, it's people on the street. And that you really make an effort to build in reaction of a wide variety of people by doing your research beforehand, so that you have people you can talk to when the decision happens or the news happens. But I will say to you that it's still a battle. We work at it all the time, we talk to people, but we have to have the help of their managers to get them to comply, and it's a work in progress. But I want you to email me if you feel like it's not going well, and let me know. Okay.
And were you going to take the question?
So I'll take your question, unless you want to, do you want to take that question? It was about getting women of colour to do
It was more about multiracial societies, I think.
Well, no, I was specifically curious about the solution in Don't Expect Women of Color to DEI programs hire specialists. I'm wondering what your news organizations are doing to help in that regard. Are there outside specialists or firms that are looking at these issues from a lens that can assist you in this work where you are not then burnt out as leaders in this work?
So I will say a couple of things. First of all, we have a DEI person that works in HR who's, we had one leave, we're hiring a new one. And that person typically has been a good partner for us in making sure that we have some overall programming for the whole company, so it's not just on me and the news department. I have partnership with the Maynard Institute, which I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they do a lot of journalism education, and they are wonderful people. And then there's a community of people that I fellowship with in the DEI community, it's specifically in journalism, that really help when things get frustrating. And I'm about to lose my mind. So, and then I swim.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Sorry we've kept you 3 minutes extra. Thank you so much for coming.